Okay, so today is Monday, June 26th, 2023. Thursday, June 29th is the day of Peter and Paul, the Holy Apostles. And so today I'm going to do all of the readings for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday and try to weave them together so that we can experience kind of the meaning of what Thursday is. So I'll read the highlighted text. This is Paul talking about God, who has endured with much patience the vessels of wrath made for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for the vessels of mercy. And from Matthew, this is Jesus talking. Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight. And then from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been coming violently. So we talked previously about the way religion is not the process of binding oneself to something, but the way one is being bound to things by an autonomous binding factor, which is the preconscious or esoteric logos. So the question for today is, what happens when this binding factor binds a person to someone who commits against them some act of violence, like we would see, for example, in sexual or other abuse? So the text suggests that God endures with much patience the vessels of wrath made for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for the vessels of mercy. We at the same time can recall that the image of this sacrificial God is also the essence of the human being. And so we can also say that God in the human being is the one who endures the vessels of wrath, or the vessel of wrath, their body, the imperfect world, and violence, for this same glory. Of course, this is nearly unthinkable to someone who has undergone serious abuse, and so it would not be theologically consistent to say to a trauma survivor, yes, well, it's all for God's glory, because that doesn't do justice to their pain. What can only be said from one human being under the conditions of finitude to another under that same imperfect condition is that given the act of violence done against them, there may be a way to understand that trauma through an introverted attitude that will help give them the sight Jesus wants to communicate to John, that the image of God in the human being wants to tell its ego, namely, that there is an attitude towards what seems to be an otherwise unbearable and impossible to justify violence that can see it as, at the same time, something else, that violence now brings with it a prophetic vision, and more than a prophetic vision, a message about the meaning and purpose of the God of love, who makes himself known through his own sacrifice in the creation of the world, so that sacrifice of God is the same sacrifice of the human individual that has endured the abusive or violent act. Okay, so now moving to Tuesday, we're considering the way in which the individual who's undergone some unjustifiable violence is, in the endurance of that violence, the very image of the self-sacrificial God who gave up his infinite nature in the creation of the finite world. And so we're going to keep reading on into Tuesday and consider the attributes of this sacrificial God, because it seems so inconceivable that this might be true. So the text in Romans 10 suggests our premise already, that in God's foreknowledge he does not reject those that he made in his sacrificial image, but rather God, in Matthew 11, as the God of wisdom, is known by his children, or, in the human sense, through trauma, the survivor is given a wisdom that they perhaps do not want. So in Romans 11, we find that salvation comes in and through trespass, and so the endurance of violence by a victim is at the same time the endurance of trespass, through which the possibility of salvation is made as an offering to the abuser, and so the endurance of abuse is the making of the salvation of the abuser. This, of course, sounds quite horrible, and again, the question arises why God would create a world where this type of process seems to be at its heart. In Matthew, we're given the suggestion that this is all ultimately related to the day of judgment, which is a reference in the psychological mode to the appearance of what has been called in the Christian tradition the vision of God, which is really related more to the human being being seen by God than it is to the human being seeing God. But both in the experience are true. This experience of being seen by God, in what is referred to in the tradition as judgment, contains within it everything we've been talking about and I've been trying to articulate, namely, the experience of the messianic attitude that integrates the personality in its spiritual and resentful aspects under the dimension of sacrifice. And so here we're referring back to Sunday, where on Sunday we talked about Mary Magdalene and the demons. And so these are the spiritual and resentful aspects. The resentful aspect here is kind of a proxy for the traumatic experience, which really you cannot give an articulation of it. Trauma is sort of this ineffable, horrible experience that the easiest way to get to it is through the resent that it creates. And so I don't want to just gloss over the traumatic aspect, but when you're working with the integration of a trauma, the integration is between, on the one hand, the spiritual sensitive aspect, which endures the violence, and then the resentful aspect that fights against its integration. So the results of this experience brought about in some way by the traumatic binding experience, right? So this is the victim, essentially, or the survivor, who binds to the perpetrator, brought about by the traumatic binding experience and the unfolding of its consequences, has, we read here, so many profound effects that, quote, were every one of them to be written, the world itself could not contain its books. So the idea here is that the ultimate trajectory of the traumatic experience is some profound effect, which are so numerous that they couldn't be written. So perhaps first among these effects are, we read in Romans, a boasting of things that show weakness. So through the trauma, the individual is transformed into someone who boasts in their weakness. For in this weakness, the human being more closely resembles the Messiah, who reveals the sacrificial nature of the Creator God, who in creating the finite world gave up his eternal nature. And in this messianic image, the mercy of the gift of God through his creation of the world is made known to the world, through now the psychological binding of others to the survivor, who is now weak, but also strong in God. And so this binding of others to the survivor occasions the separation of the spiritual and resentful natures in others from their very encounter with the survivor, and the making of others' lives more deeply into the image of God. So through this process, we read, comes to the survivor, we've been considering beautiful visions and experiences of God and God's presence in their lives and in the world, and an abundance of revelation that stems ultimately from that traumatic thorn in their flesh. And so too, an understanding of the sufficiency of God's grace. And so it's on this foundation, or rock, of this revelation, that the world will be transformed more deeply into the kingdom of heaven.